There are moments in life when it feels like everything is at a standstill. You've prayed, you've waited, you've believed, and yet nothing seems to be moving forward. It can be frustrating, disheartening even, to watch the days, months, or even years go by without seeing the answers you desperately long for. You begin to question whether God is listening, whether He's forgotten about you, or worse, whether He even cares. But what if the delay isn't a denial? What if God is not ignoring your prayers, but instead aligning everything perfectly in His divine timing? God operates outside of our human understanding of time. What seems like a long way to us is just a moment in eternity for Him. We live in a world that teaches us to expect instant results. We want quick answers, immediate breakthroughs, and fast solutions. But God is not bound by our schedules, and He does not rush His plans. His ways are higher, His perspective is greater, and His purpose is beyond what we can comprehend. Every delay has a reason, and every moment of waiting is shaping you for what's to come. Look at the life of Abraham. God promised him that he would be the father of many nations, yet years went by without a child. He and Sarah grew older, and with each passing year, the promise seemed more impossible. They had to wait, and in that waiting, their faith was tested. Abraham made mistakes, tried to take matters into his own hands, and at times he struggled to believe. But God was not in a hurry. He fulfilled His promise at the appointed time. Not when Abraham thought it should happen, but when it was divinely orchestrated. When we face delays, we often think something is wrong. We assume that God has changed His mind, or that we've done something to block our blessing. But delays are often God's way of preparing us. Sometimes He is strengthening our faith. Sometimes He is removing distractions. Sometimes He is waiting for the right people to be in place, or for circumstances to align in a way that we could never arrange on our own. Imagine Joseph, who had dreams of greatness as a young man. He saw visions of his family bowing before him, and he knew that God had a purpose for his life. But instead of stepping immediately into that destiny, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and later thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. If anyone had a reason to question God's timing, it was Joseph. Yet through every setback, God was working behind the scenes. Had Joseph been elevated too soon, he would not have been ready for the position God had prepared for him. The hardships he endured refined his character, deepened his wisdom, and prepared him for the role of second in command over Egypt. When the time was right, everything changed in an instant. Some of you are in a waiting season, wondering why God hasn't answered yet. You see others moving forward, getting their breakthroughs, receiving their blessings, while you remain in the same place. It's easy to compare, to feel forgotten, to wonder if you've been left behind. But what if your wait is not punishment but protection? What if the reason things haven't happened yet is because God is keeping you from something that would harm you? What if He is still preparing you for the very thing you've been praying for? We often want the blessing without the process. But God is more concerned with our preparation than our impatience. A blessing given too soon can become a burden. A door open at the wrong time can lead to disaster. Just because you don't see movement doesn't mean that nothing is happening. There are things shifting in the spiritual realm that you cannot see. God is working out details that are beyond your understanding. He is setting things in motion in a way that when the breakthrough comes, it will be undeniable that it was His hand that orchestrated it. Think about David. He was anointed as king while he was still a shepherd boy. But he didn't step into his kingship right away. Instead, he spent years running from Saul, hiding in caves, facing battles and enduring hardships. Why? Because God was preparing him. Had David been crowned immediately, he wouldn't have had the wisdom, endurance, or leadership skills necessary to rule a nation. His waiting season, it was in the fields as a shepherd that he learned to protect. It was in the wilderness that he learned to trust God. It was in the battles that he developed the courage to lead. God does not operate on our deadlines. When we impose our own timelines on Him, we set ourselves up for disappointment. We think if it doesn't happen by this date, then it must not be meant for me. But God doesn't work that way. He is not controlled by human expectations. He knows what He's doing. He sees the full picture. He understands the dangers ahead, the people who aren't ready yet, the situations that still need to be adjusted. The waiting is not wasted. It is a time of pruning, shaping, and refining. It is where God removes what is unnecessary, strengthens what is weak, and builds up what is needed. It is in the waiting that faith is developed. Because true faith is not about believing when everything is happening. It's about believing when nothing seems to be happening at all. Some of you are asking for things that require greater responsibility, and God is making sure you're ready. Some of you are asking for opportunities, but God knows that if He gives them to you now, they would overwhelm you instead of bless you. Some of you are asking for relationships, but God is still working on you and the other person so that when the time comes, it will be built on a solid foundation. Waiting seasons are seasons of growth. The deeper the roots, the stronger the tree. If God is making you wait, He is also making you stronger. If He is delaying something, He is also preparing something better than you expected. When the right time comes, everything will fall into place effortlessly. The doors will open that no man can shut. The opportunities will come without you having to force them. The relationships will align naturally. The things you've been praying for will be released in a way that will leave no doubt that it was God's perfect timing. Fear is one of the greatest weapons the enemy uses to keep people from walking in the fullness of God's plan. It creeps in when things don't go as expected, when prayers seem unanswered, when the future looks uncertain. It whispers lies, making you question whether God is really with you, whether He really has a plan, whether He will really come through. Fear tells you to retreat, to settle, to lower your expectation. But faith says keep going. Faith says trust even when there's no visible evidence. Faith says believe even when everything around you suggests otherwise. Faith is not the absence of fear, but the decision to trust God despite it. It is standing firm in His promises even when circumstances seem impossible. It is choosing to walk forward when fear is screaming at you to turn back. The enemy wants you to focus on what could go wrong, but God calls you to focus on Him. When Peter stepped out of the boat to walk on water, he was fine as long as his eyes were fixed on Jesus. The moment he looked at the wind and waves, fear took over and he began to sink. That's what happens when we focus on the obstacles instead of the one who has power over them. The Bible is filled with stories of people who had every reason to be afraid but chose faith instead. When the Israelites stood before the Red Sea with the Egyptian army closing in behind them, fear was everywhere. In the natural, there was no escape. They saw death approaching, but Moses stood firm and declared that God would make a way, and He did. The sea parted, and they walked through on dry land. What looked impossible became possible because faith overruled fear. Think about David standing before Goliath. He was just a shepherd boy with no military experience, facing a giant who had been a warrior since his youth. The entire army of Israel was paralyzed by fear, convinced they were too weak to win. But David saw things differently. He didn't look at Goliath's size, he looked at God's power. He didn't listen to the fearful voices around him, he listened to the voice of God. While everyone else saw an unbeatable enemy, David saw an opportunity for God to show His strength. Fear thrives on uncertainty, but faith thrives on trust. Fear will tell you that the problem is too big, that you're not strong enough, that you'll never make it. Faith reminds you that nothing is impossible with God. Fear magnifies obstacles. Faith magnifies God's ability to overcome them. Sometimes fear doesn't come in the form of a giant or an army, but in the quiet moments when doubt creeps in. It's the fear of failure, the fear of rejection, the fear of stepping into the unknown. It's the hesitation to pursue what God has placed in your heart because you don't know how it will turn out. But faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. Abraham was told to leave everything familiar and go to a land God would show him. He wasn't given a detailed plan, no clear path, just a promise that God would lead him. He could have let fear stop him, but he chose faith. He stepped out not knowing where he was going, but knowing that God was with him. And because of that faith, he became the father of many nations. Faith is about moving forward even when you don't see the whole picture. It's about trusting that God is already in your future, preparing the way. It's about believing that He is in control even when life feels out of control. Fear will always try to keep you stuck, but faith will always push you toward your destiny. Fear wants to convince you that the storm you're facing is too powerful, that the sickness is too strong, that the financial struggle is too deep, that the situation is too far gone. But faith reminds you that Jesus calmed the storm with just a word, that He healed the sick with just a touch, that He fed thousands with just a few loaves and fish. The same God who did miracles then is still working now. The enemy wants you to believe that your faith is useless, that your prayers aren't making a difference, that your situation will never change. But faith is not about what you see, it's about what you know. And what you know is that God is faithful. You know that He has never abandoned His children. You know that He is still in control. Fear is loud, but faith doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's a quiet confidence that refuses to be shaken. Sometimes it's just waking up each day and saying, God, I trust you. Sometimes it's taking one small step forward even when you don't see the whole staircase. Sometimes it's standing firm in the middle of uncertainty, knowing that God is working behind the scenes. The enemy wants to keep you paralyzed in fear because he knows that if you ever fully step into faith, nothing will be able to stop you. He knows that if you trust God completely, you will walk into every promise He has for you. That's why the attacks come. That's why the doubts try to creep in. That's why fear tries to keep you from moving forward. Because the enemy is terrified of what will happen when you fully trust God. Faith isn't always easy. It requires surrender. It requires letting go of control. It requires believing when there's no evidence yet. But the more you exercise your faith, the stronger it becomes. Just like a muscle, faith grows when it's tested. It grows when you choose to trust even in uncertainty. It grows when you refuse to let fear win. God is calling you to step out in faith. He is calling you to trust Him even when it doesn't make sense. He is calling you to believe that He is bigger than your circumstances. He is calling you to walk forward, knowing that He has already gone before you. Fear will try to hold you back, but faith will push you forward. There are moments in life when everything seems to go wrong at the same time. The pressure intensifies, the battles become relentless. And just when you think you're about to get a breakthrough, something happens that shakes you to the core. It feels like every step forward is met with resistance. Every door that seemed to open suddenly slams shut. And the weight of discouragement tries to settle in. This is not a coincidence. The enemy knows when you are on the verge of something great. He knows when God is about to move in a powerful way, and that is why the attacks increase right before a major blessing. The enemy does not waste energy on people who are not a threat. If you are facing extreme opposition, it is because there is something on the other side that he does not want you to reach. Every struggle, every setback, every unexpected hardship is an indication that you are getting closer to what God has promised. The enemy is not attacking you because of where you are. He is attacking you because of where you are going. He sees what God is preparing for you, and his goal is to make you give up before you get there. Think about Job. He was a righteous man, blessed with abundance, health, and a beautiful family. Everything in his life was going well until suddenly disaster struck. In a matter of moments, he lost everything: his wealth, his children, and his health. His friends turned against him, and even his wife told him to curse God and die. The attacks were relentless, but what Job didn't know was that his suffering was not the end of his story. The enemy had tried to destroy him because of what was coming next. In the end, God restored Job and gave him double for his trouble. What looked like devastation was actually the setup for greater blessings. Before breakthrough comes, there is often a period of testing. The enemy will try to wear you down, make you question God's promises, and convince you that nothing will ever change. The pressure increases, the weight feels unbearable, and every part of you wants to quit. But this is the moment when you must stand firm. The enemy would not be fighting this hard if there wasn't something incredible on the other side. When the Israelites were on the verge of entering the promised land, the opposition was intense. They had spent years in the wilderness, and just when they were about to step into what God had promised, they faced giants in the land. The enemy wanted to intimidate them, make them feel small, and convince them that they would never win. Many of them believed the lie, and because of that, they missed out on what was already theirs. But Joshua and Caleb had a different perspective. They saw the giants, but they also saw God's faithfulness. They refused to let fear keep them from their breakthrough. The enemy knows that if you hold on a little longer, if you keep pressing forward, if you refuse to give up, you will walk right into the blessing that God has for you. That is why he brings distractions, doubt, and discouragement at the most critical moments. Right before Jesus began his ministry, he was led into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting for 40 days, he was physically weak, but spiritually he was prepared. The enemy came at him with every possible temptation, trying to derail him before his mission even began. If Jesus had given in, if he had doubted his identity, if he had compromised, the entire course of history would have changed. But he stood firm, resisted the enemy, and walked into his divine purpose. When you feel the heaviest attacks, the greatest pressure, and the strongest resistance, it is not a sign that you are losing, it is a sign that you are winning. The enemy sees what you cannot see. He sees the doors that are about to open, the opportunities that are about to be released, and the favor that is about to be poured out. His only hope is to stop you before you get there. Many times, right before breakthrough, everything in the natural looks like it's falling apart. Right before promotion, you may experience loss. Right before financial breakthrough, unexpected expenses may arise. Right before a new opportunity, doors may close. The enemy wants you to focus on the chaos and lose sight of the promise. He wants you to get discouraged and walk away right before things shift in your favor. Joseph had a dream that he would be in a position of power, but before that dream was fulfilled, he went through betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment. He was falsely accused, forgotten, and left to wonder if the dream was ever real. It would have been easy for him to give up, to assume that God had abandoned him, to let the hardships make him bitter. But what Joseph did not know was that every trial was leading him closer to his breakthrough. What seemed like a series of misfortunes was actually God positioning him for his purpose. When the time was right, in a single moment, he was taken from the prison to the palace. The attacks before breakthrough are strategic. The enemy uses exhaustion to make you too tired to fight. He uses distractions to shift your focus away from what God is doing. He uses people to speak negativity into your life, making you doubt what God has promised. He will try to convince you that it's not worth it, that things will never change, that you should just accept defeat. But the greater the opposition, the greater the blessing on the other side. There is a pattern in Scripture. Before elevation, there is opposition. Before miracles, there are moments of struggle. Before victory, there is a battle. The enemy will not attack what is not valuable. If you are facing resistance, it is because you are stepping into something that the enemy does not want you to have. The enemy's goal is not just to slow you down. It is to stop you altogether. But what he does not realize is that the very thing he is using to break you is what God is using to make you stronger. God never allows an attack without purpose. He uses every struggle, every hardship, and every trial for your good. The very thing that was meant to destroy you is what he will use to elevate you. The battle is not an indication that you are failing. It is proof that you are moving forward. The attacks are temporary, but the breakthrough is eternal. The enemy fights hardest when he knows he is losing. He throws everything he can at you because he knows that what God is about to release in your life is beyond anything you have ever imagined. There will be moments when you feel like you can't take another step, when you feel like the weight is too heavy, when you wonder if you misheard God. The temptation to quit will be strong, the doubts will be loud, and the pressure will be intense. But that is when you must hold on the tightest. The storm always rages the worst right before it ends. The darkest part of the night is right before the dawn. The enemy always fights the hardest when he knows his time is up. Praise is a powerful weapon that shifts the atmosphere and prepares the way for God to move. It is easy to worship when everything is going well, when prayers have been answered and when breakthroughs have already come. But true faith is revealed when praise is lifted before the miracle happens, when worship rises in the middle of uncertainty, and when trust in God is unwavering despite the circumstances. In the natural, it does not always make sense to praise before seeing the outcome. The mind wants evidence, reassurance, and visible proof that things are improving. But faith does not operate by sight. Faith praises before the breakthrough, before the healing, before the provision. Faith says, God, I trust you even when I don't understand. I worship you not because of what I see, but because of who you are. This kind of faith moves mountains. The Bible is filled with examples of people who praise before their miracle. When Paul and Silas were in prison, beaten and chained, they did not wait for their situation to change before worshiping. They began to sing praises to God in the midnight hour. And as they did, the prison doors opened and their chains fell off. Their praise preceded their deliverance. They did not know how or when God would move, but they praised anyway. Their faith was not in their circumstances. It was in the one who had the power to change them. When the Israelites faced the walls of Jericho, God gave them an unusual battle plan. Instead of attacking with weapons, they were told to march around the city for 7 days and then shout in victory. At first, it must have seemed strange to praise before the walls had fallen. But they obeyed, and when they lifted up a shout of praise, the walls came crashing down. The victory was secured the moment they chose to trust God and praise before seeing the results. Praise is an act of surrender. It says, God, I trust you no matter what. It is an expression of faith that acknowledges His power, His goodness, and His sovereignty. When praise is lifted before the miracle, it declares that God is greater than the problem, that He is faithful even in the waiting, and that His promises will come to pass. Many times the delay before a miracle is a test of faith. Will you trust God in the silence? Will you worship when nothing seems to be changing? Will you lift your hands in praise even when the battle feels unending? The enemy wants to steal your praise because he knows how powerful it is. He wants to fill your mind with doubt, discouragement, and fear. He wants to keep you so focused on the problem that you forget to magnify the one who is greater than it. But praise silences the enemy. It reminds him that no matter what happens, your faith remains unshaken. When King Jehoshaphat faced a vast enemy army, he did not rely on his own strength. Instead, he put the worshipers at the front of the battle line. They sang praises to God, declaring His faithfulness. And as they worshiped, the enemy was thrown into confusion and destroyed themselves. The battle was won not by weapons, but by praise. God responded to their faith, and the victory was secured before they even had to fight. Praise shifts the focus from the problem to the promise. It realigns the heart to trust in God's faithfulness rather than the uncertainty of the situation. It declares that God is still working, even when there is no visible evidence. It reminds the soul that He has never failed before, and He will not fail now. When worry tries to take over, praise is the antidote. When fear creeps in, worship is the response. When doubt whispers that nothing is changing, faith rises through praise. There is power in speaking and singing God's promises. When praise is lifted, faith increases. It is impossible to truly worship and remain in a place of fear. The enemy cannot stand in the presence of praise because it is a direct attack against his lies. He wants you to believe that your situation is hopeless, that things will never change, that God has forgotten you. But praise says otherwise. Praise reminds the heart of every miracle God has done before. It declares that if He did it once, He will do it again. Some of the greatest breakthroughs come when praise is offered in the hardest moments. It is easy to worship on the mountaintop, but true faith is revealed in the valley. True faith lifts hands in surrender when there are more questions than answers. True faith sings in the midnight hour, believing that the dawn is coming. True faith declares victory before it is seen. Worship is not about feelings. It is about choosing to exalt God regardless of the circumstances. Feelings change, but God's promises remain the same. When praise becomes a lifestyle rather than a reaction to circumstances, miracles follow. The woman with the issue of blood did not wait until she was healed to believe. She reached out in faith before the miracle happened. Blind Bartimaeus did not wait until he could see to call out to Jesus. He cried out in faith before the healing came. The 10 lepers were told to go and show themselves to the priests, and as they went, they were healed. Their faith was activated before the miracle. Praise is a declaration of trust. It is choosing to worship God not just for what He has done, but for what He is about to do. It is believing that even when nothing looks different in the natural, everything is shifting in the spiritual. Praise is a weapon that breaks chains, moves mountains, and ushers in breakthrough. The enemy knows this, which is why he tries so hard to keep believers silent. He wants you to focus on the problem, to dwell on the pain, to give in to discouragement. But when you choose to praise in the middle of the storm, you declare that your faith is greater than your fear. There is something powerful about praising before the miracle. It is an act of expectation, a declaration that God is moving even when it is not yet visible. It is trusting that He is working behind the scenes, orchestrating every detail for His glory. When Paul and Silas praised in prison, they had no guarantee of how God would move. When the Israelites shouted at Jericho, they did not yet see the walls fall. When Jehoshaphat sent worshipers ahead of the army, the battle had not yet been won. But in every case, praise went forth first and miracles followed. God responds to faith. He moves when His people worship in spirit and in truth. Praise prepares the heart to receive what He has already planned. It shifts the atmosphere and invites His presence to work in ways beyond human understanding. It releases his power into situations that seem impossible. The enemy may try to stop the blessing, but he cannot stop the praise. And where there is praise, there is victory.